I have carried this baby for 7 months. I have thrown up every morning for you people, and you stand there like I'm asking for something crazy.
You don't get to stand there and tell me what I'm allowed to feel. Teresa's voice cracked on the last word. Her hands were shaking, one of them pressed flat against her stomach, like she could hold the baby still, just by pressing hard enough. Hyunwoo stood by the window with his jaw tight, his voice low, trying to keep the whole house from hearing what was happening in that room. Teresa, lower your voice. Don't tell me to lower my voice in a house you gave me. She stepped closer, tears sitting right at the edge of her eyes, refusing to fall. I have carried this baby for 7 months. I have thrown up every morning for you people, and you stand there like I'm asking for something crazy. You are, he said quietly. You know you are. Hello once again, my amazing story lovers. Welcome back to Afro Seoul Love TV. Before we get into it, if this is your first time on this channel, welcome. Go ahead and hit that like button, drop a comment, and let me know where you're watching from tonight. And subscribe so you don't miss what happens after this. Trust me, you'll want to see how this one ends. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Tamara Holmes had always been the funny one. In every room, at every dinner, she was the person cracking a joke before anyone even noticed the tension building. It was a gift, honestly. She could read a room the way most people read a book. But on a Tuesday morning, sitting in a paper gown at a private hospital in Seoul, none of that humor was helping her. The ultrasound tech had gone quiet a little too long. Tamara noticed it. She noticed everything. You're being suspiciously quiet, Tamara said, trying to keep her voice light. Did you find a second head in there or something? The tech gave a small, polite laugh and said the doctor would come speak with her directly. That was never a good sign. Dr. Yoon came in 15 minutes later with the kind of face doctors wear when they've delivered this news too many times to count. She sat across from Tamara, not behind the desk, but in the chair right next to her, which somehow made it worse. Your fibroids have grown significantly since your last scan, she said. 2 of them are pressing directly against the uterine lining. Carrying a pregnancy to term, safely, at this point, would be extremely difficult. I won't tell you it's impossible, but I would be lying if I told you it was likely. Tamara nodded slowly. She'd expected something like this. The cramping had gotten worse over the past year. The 2 miscarriages before that had already planted the fear in her chest. But hearing it out loud, in a doctor's careful, clinical voice, still hit different. Okay, Tamara said, and her voice barely shook. Okay, thank you for telling me straight. She didn't cry in that office. She waited until she was in the car, alone, before she let herself feel it. That night, she told Hyunwoo everything, sitting across from him at the kitchen island in their home, a mug of tea going cold in her hands. He listened without interrupting, the way he always did, and when she finished, he reached over and took both her hands in his. We can adopt, he said simply. I already love a child I haven't met yet. I don't need it to come from your body for it to be ours. It was the kind of thing that should have fixed everything. And in a lot of ways, it did fix something in her chest. Hearing him say it with that much certainty. But there was still a small, stubborn part of her that wanted to know what it felt like to carry her own child, just once, before she let that dream go completely. I hear you, she said. I do. But can I just sit with this a little longer before we make any decisions? Take all the time you need, he said. I'm not going anywhere. He meant it. That was the thing about Hyunwoo, that people who didn't know him well never understood. He wasn't a man who said things to fill silence. If he said it, he meant it, and he'd prove it 100 times over before this story was done. His mother did not share his patience. A week later, Tamara found herself in the traditional garden behind the family estate, sitting near the stone lanterns, when Aomeoni Seo came to find her. The older woman didn't sit. She stood with her hands folded in front of her, the way she always did when she had something to say that she'd already decided was true. A child should come from the 2 of you, she said, no preamble, no softness. Not from some outside arrangement, not from a stranger's body. I haven't decided anything yet, Tamara said carefully. You are already thinking about it. I can see it on your face. Aomeoni Seo's eyes were sharp, missing nothing. This is not how our family does things. Tamara took a breath before she answered, keeping her voice even, respectful, but firm. With respect, Aomeoni, this is my body and my choice to make. Your son supports me either way. I would love for you to as well, but I understand if you need time. The older woman said nothing else. She simply turned and walked back toward the house, her silence heavier than any words could have been. It would take months before that particular wound started to close. 2 weeks after that conversation, Tamara sat across from Teresa Powell in their favorite cafe near the university, the smell of cinnamon and espresso thick in the air. They'd been friends since Tamara's second year of grad school, back when Teresa was just starting to build her name doing makeup for actual film sets instead of weddings. 15 years of friendship, 15 years of knowing each other's family history, bad exes, and secrets. Tamara turned her cup slowly in her hands, working up the nerve to say what she'd rehearsed in the mirror that morning. I need to ask you something, Tamara said, and you can say no. I need you to know that up front, because I will still love you either way. Teresa raised an eyebrow, half smiling. You're scaring me a little. Would you carry my baby? Tamara asked. Just like that. No easing into it. I know it's a lot. I know it's more than a lot. But I trust you more than anyone in this world outside of my husband, and I can't think of carrying my own child in anyone else's body but yours. Teresa went still for a second. Just a second, but Tamara caught it. Then her face broke into something that looked like joy, and she reached across the table and grabbed both of Tamara's hands. Yes, Teresa said, almost before Tamara had finished the sentence. Yes, of course, whatever you need. It felt, in that moment, like the most natural yes in the world. Tamara would think back on how fast that yes came many months later, turning it over in her mind, wondering what she missed. But right then, sitting in that cafe with her best friend's hands wrapped around hers, all she felt was relief, and gratitude, and something close to hope. The legal side of things started the following week, in Attorney Bay's office on the 14th floor of a building overlooking the Han River. He was the kind of lawyer Hyunwoo's family had used for 2 generations, careful with his words, slow to promise anything he couldn't guarantee. He laid out the contract point by point, compensation for Teresa, paid in installments through the pregnancy, and a final sum after delivery. Full medical decision rights would remain with Tamara and Hyunwoo once viability was confirmed. A confidentiality clause, necessary given Hyunwoo's public profile as CEO. And a relinquishment clause, spelled out in plain, unmistakable language, that the child belonged to Tamara and Hyunwoo from the moment of birth. Isaiah joined the meeting by video call from his kitchen table back in the States, the morning light coming through his window behind him. He listened to the whole thing quietly, arms crossed, the same look on his face he used to get when he was checking the oil on a car before he'd let anyone drive it. I got one question, Isaiah said, once Attorney Bay finished. What happens if she changes her mind? Attorney Bay adjusted his glasses. The contract is legally binding. The relinquishment clause is airtight under Korean surrogacy arrangement law, as structured through the private agreement. That's not what I asked, Isaiah said, gentle, but not backing down. I asked what happens to my daughter's heart if her best friend changes her mind about handing over that baby. Paper's paper. People are people. The room went quiet for a moment. Tamara reached over and touched her father's hand through the screen, even though he couldn't feel it. Daddy, Teresa's not like that, she said. She's not going to change her mind. Isaiah didn't argue. He just nodded slowly, the way he did when he decided not to push a point he knew he couldn't win that day. All right, he said. I trust you. I just want everything written down real good, just in case. They signed the contract 2 days later. The following week brought them to the fertility clinic, a sleek, glass-walled building in Gangnam that specialized in exactly this kind of arrangement. Teresa went through her screening first, blood work, hormone panels, a full physical to confirm she could safely carry. Tamara went through her own round of injections to retrieve her eggs. It was in the lab, during the embryo creation process, that a nurse reached for a vial and paused, frowning at the label for exactly 3 seconds before catching what looked like a transcription error and correcting it. It was such a small moment nobody in the room even noticed it happening. The nurse fixed it, moved on, and never mentioned it to anyone. It would be many months before that tiny mistake mattered again. 2 weeks later, the embryo was ready. Hyunwoo insisted on being there for the transfer, holding Teresa's hand on one side of the table while Tamara stood on the other, gripping Teresa's other hand so tight her knuckles went pale. You're doing something incredible, Hyunwoo told Teresa, his voice full of real gratitude. We will never forget this. Teresa smiled up at him, and for just a flicker of a second, something passed over her face that wasn't quite gratitude, wasn't quite friendship. It looked almost like longing. Nobody caught it. The procedure took less than 10 minutes. That same week, Hyun-woo handed Teresa the keys to a house he'd arranged for her. A 2-story home in a quiet neighborhood, close enough to the mansion that Tamara could visit easily. Far enough that Teresa had her own privacy. It had a garden out back, sunlight pouring into every room. "This is too much," Teresa said, standing in the doorway, keys in her open palm. "It's not too much," Hyun-woo said. "You're giving us something we can't put a price on. The least we can do is make sure you're comfortable while you do it." He thanked her again, sincerely, and left not long after to give her space to settle in. Teresa stood in that doorway a while longer after his car pulled away, looking down at her hand, at the spot where his had briefly touched hers when he passed her the keys. Sarang came home from university that same weekend, back for a short break between rotations. She was in her 4th year of medical school, sharp as anyone twice her age, and she made a point of stopping by Teresa's new house to introduce herself properly. She'd heard about the surrogacy from her brother, and being the kind of person who understood exactly how complicated pregnancy could be, medically and emotionally, she wanted to meet the woman carrying her future niece or nephew. They sat in Teresa's kitchen, tea between them, and the conversation flowed easily enough until Teresa started talking about Hyun-woo. It wasn't anything dramatic, just small things, the way she said his name a little too warmly, the way she mentioned a text he'd sent her that morning checking in on her, and how she'd read it 3 times before responding. Small things, but Sarang noticed them, the way she noticed everything, filing it away without comment. 2 weeks after the transfer, Tamara got the call she'd been waiting for. The pregnancy was confirmed. She screamed, actually screamed, right there in her office at the research lab, startling 2 of her colleagues who came running to see if she was hurt. When she explained, they laughed and hugged her, and one of them ran out to grab a bottle of something to celebrate with. That evening, the 3 of them met at the cafe, the same one where Tamara had first asked, and this time there was real champagne for Tamara and Hyun-woo, and sparkling cider for Teresa, who couldn't drink. They toasted, laughing, Tamara crying happy tears for the first time in months. "To the 3 of us," Tamara said, raising her glass, "and in about 8 months, to the 4 of us." "To the 4 of us," Teresa echoed, smiling so wide it reached her eyes. It was, without question, the last purely happy night the 3 of them would share for a long time. The first trimester passed the way most first trimesters do, quietly, carefully, full of appointments and small worries that mostly amounted to nothing. Teresa handled the morning sickness with more grace than most people manage, texting Tamara updates almost daily, photos of the tiny bump starting to show. Hyun-woo attended every appointment at the prenatal wellness center, out of respect for the child growing inside Teresa, always alongside Tamara, holding her hand in the waiting room, while they listened for the heartbeat together. It became a rhythm, the 3 of them, moving through this strange new territory as a unit. By the 2nd trimester, that rhythm started to shift, so slowly that nobody noticed at first. It began with small requests. Teresa would call ahead of an appointment, apologetic, explaining that Tamara had an important deadline at the lab, so could Hyun-woo maybe come alone this time, just so someone was there. It made sense, on paper. Tamara did have a demanding job, running clinical trials for a pharmaceutical research firm, and she genuinely couldn't always break away. So Hyun-woo went alone. Once, then twice. Then it just became normal. One night in late June, close to 11:40, Tamara's phone rang while she and Hyun-woo were watching a show on the couch. It was Teresa, her voice tight with panic, saying she was cramping badly and didn't want to call an ambulance over nothing, but could someone come, please, just to check on her. Hyun-woo was already grabbing his coat before Tamara finished processing the words. "I'll go," he said. "You stay, get some rest. I'll call you the second I know anything." He arrived at Teresa's house 20 minutes later to find her sitting at the kitchen table, candles lit, a full plate of food set out like she'd been expecting company for dinner rather than dealing with an emergency. The cramping, it turned out, was mild. The kind of Braxton Hicks contraction any doctor would have told her over the phone wasn't serious. But she looked at him with such relief when he walked in that he didn't have the heart to point out he could have talked her through it by phone. He checked on her, made sure she drank water, sat with her for 20 minutes to be safe, then left. When he got home, he told Tamara the whole thing plainly. No hesitation in his voice, no guilt hiding underneath the words, because as far as he was concerned, nothing had happened worth hiding. "She's probably just scared," Tamara said, settling back against him on the couch. "First pregnancy, I'd be terrified too." "Probably," Hyun-woo agreed. Neither of them thought much more about it that night. A few days later, Tamara met Sarang for dinner at a rooftop restaurant overlooking the city lights. The two of them close in a way that had grown naturally over the years, more like sisters than in-laws. Sarang ordered soju for herself, sparkling water for Tamara, who was staying off alcohol in solidarity even though she wasn't the one pregnant. "I need to say something, and I need you to actually hear me," Sarang said, setting her glass down with more weight than the moment called for. "I don't trust her." Tamara raised an eyebrow. "Teresa? I've watched the way she looks at my brother," Sarang said. "It's not friendship. I don't know what it is exactly, but it's not just friendship." Tamara sat back, genuinely surprised. "Sarang, I've known that woman 15 years. She held my hand through 2 miscarriages. She's carrying my child right now, out of love for me, not for him." "I'm not saying she doesn't love you," Sarang pressed. "I'm saying something else might be growing alongside that baby, and I don't think she even realizes it herself yet." Tamara wanted to laugh it off, and mostly did, changing the subject to Sarang's upcoming exams. But something about the certainty in Sarang's voice sat uneasily in her chest for the rest of the night. That same week, Isaiah called, his usual Sunday check-in, and somewhere in the middle of catching up on the weather back home and how the pregnancy was going, he said something that echoed what Sarang had said, almost word for word, though he had no way of knowing that. "You be careful, baby," he said. "I watched something like this happen to your cousin Denise, years back. Her surrogate ended up so attached to that baby and to the whole idea of that family, she nearly didn't hand him over. People bond to what's growing inside them. It's not always about bad intentions. Sometimes it's just what happens." "Teresa's not like that, Daddy," Tamara said, the same words she'd used with Sarang, though this time they felt a little more like something she was trying to convince herself of, rather than a fact she was simply stating. "I hope you're right," Isaiah said. "I truly do." The following weekend, Tamara and Teresa met at a neighborhood park, walking slow laps around the pond, while Teresa rubbed her rounded belly and they debated baby names, laughing over the strange ones Tamara's coworkers kept suggesting. It was a good afternoon, easy and light, until Teresa said something that stuck to Tamara's ribs the rest of the day. "Do you ever worry," Teresa said, still smiling, still walking, like it was nothing, "that Hyun-woo could have done better than you? Someone who could actually give him a baby the normal way, without needing someone else's body to do it?" Tamara laughed because it sounded like a joke, delivered with a joke's rhythm, a joke's smile. "Girl, if he wanted someone else, he had 32 years to find her before he found me. I'm not worried." Teresa laughed too, and they kept walking, and the moment passed. But Tamara would think about that comment again later, turning it over, wondering exactly what had been underneath it. A week after that, Teresa showed up unannounced at Hyun-woo's corporate headquarters, telling the front desk she was dropping off prenatal vitamins he'd apparently forgotten at home. His assistant, visibly caught off guard since Teresa had never once come to the office before, called him down to the lobby. He met her there, thanked her, and gently but clearly told her that next time, she should just have things like that delivered instead of coming in person. It was the first time he drew a line. It would not be the last. 7 months into the pregnancy, everything came to a head on a rainy Thursday evening. In the house Hyun-woo had given Teresa. In the same kitchen, where he'd once sat with her over a plate of food during a false alarm. She'd called him that afternoon, her voice softer than usual, asking if he could come by after work, that she needed to talk to him about something important regarding the baby. He went, no hesitation, because that's who he was, a man who showed up when someone said they needed him. But when he arrived, there was no talk of the baby. Teresa stood across the kitchen from him, her hands twisting together, and finally said the words she'd apparently been carrying for months. "I think I'm in love with you," she said. "I've tried to fight it. I swear to you, I have tried. But carrying this baby, being this close to your family, watching how you show up for people, I can't pretend anymore." Hyun-woo went completely still. For a moment he said nothing, just stared at her like he was waiting for her to take it back, to say she was joking, that pregnancy hormones were making her say something ridiculous. When she didn't, when she just stood there, waiting, hopeful, he shook his head slowly. "Teresa, no," he said, firm, immediate, no softness in it at all. "I don't feel that. I have never felt that. I love my wife. I have loved her since the day I met her, and nothing about this pregnancy, nothing about any of this, has changed that." "But you come when I call," she said, her voice rising. "You sit with me. You checked on me that night. You?" "Because you're carrying my child," he said. "Because I respect you, and I'm grateful to you. That is not the same thing as what you're describing, and I need you to hear that clearly, right now." Her face crumpled, and she started to cry, and for a second something in him softened out of pure instinct, the part of him that hated seeing anyone in pain. But he didn't move toward her. He stood exactly where he was. "This has to stop," he said. "If it doesn't, I'll have to step back from being involved in your care day to day, medically necessary or not. I need you to understand I mean that." He left not long after, driving straight home, and that same night, sitting across from Tamara at their kitchen island, he told her everything. Every word Teresa had said, every word he'd said back. He didn't soften it, didn't leave anything out to protect himself or spare her feelings. He laid it out completely. Tamara listened without interrupting, her face unreadable, and when he finished, she didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She simply nodded once, thanked him for telling her the truth immediately, and reached for her phone. "I need you to know something," Tamara said, before she dialed. "I'm not upset with you. Not for 1 second. You did exactly what you should have done." She meant it completely, and the certainty in her voice was its own kind of remarkable, considering what she'd just heard. Then she called Teresa. "You don't get to be angry that I have what you wanted," Tamara said into the phone, her voice calm, controlled, more dangerous for how steady it was. "You get to carry my daughter with dignity for the rest of this pregnancy, or you get to walk away from this arrangement completely, right now, tonight. Those are the only 2 options left." There was a long silence on the other end, then crying, then apologies, spilling out fast and desperate. Teresa swore it would never happen again, begged to stay involved, promised she understood how badly she'd crossed a line. She talked about the baby, about how much she loved this child already, about not wanting to lose her place in its life. Against Sarang's advice, against the quiet worry still sitting in the back of her own mind from that conversation with her father, Tamara gave her one more chance. 15 years of history didn't disappear because of one terrible night, she told herself. People made mistakes. People could still be trusted to fix them. Sarang, when she heard, was less forgiving. "You should have ended the arrangement tonight," she told Tamara over the phone, frustration clear in her voice. "This isn't a mistake you fix with an apology. This is a pattern showing you exactly who she is." "She's carrying my daughter Sarang," Tamara said. "I can't just walk away from that decision lightly, and she's still my friend underneath all of this." "I hope you're right," Sarang said, echoing, without knowing it, the same words her mother had said, the same words Isaiah had said. "I really do." A month later, at a routine appointment, a new complication arose, one that had nothing to do with Teresa's feelings and everything to do with the mislabeled vial from all those months earlier. A genetic marker panel came back showing an inconsistency, something in the paperwork that didn't line up cleanly with the expected profile. The doctor delivering the news was careful, clinical, trying not to alarm anyone unnecessarily, but the words landed heavy in the room regardless. There was a possibility, however small, that something had gone wrong during the lab processing months earlier. Tamara, sitting in that office, felt her stomach drop in a way it hadn't dropped since the day she got her fibroid diagnosis. But something else rose up in her at the same time, something steadier. She was, after all, a biochemist. She understood exactly what these panels meant, and exactly how labs could make small transcription errors that looked catastrophic on paper, but meant nothing in practice. "I want the raw lab data," she said, her voice completely level. "Not the summary, the raw processing logs from the day of embryo creation." The doctor blinked, clearly not used to patients making that particular request, but agreed to pull it. It took 2 days for the clinic to produce the full documentation, and when it finally landed in Tamara's inbox, she sat at her desk at the research lab that evening, long after her colleagues had gone home, and went through it line by line, the way she'd gone through countless clinical trial results before. She found it almost immediately. A vile mislabeling on the processing sheet, caught and corrected within seconds by the technician on duty, documented in a footnote that had simply never made it into the summary report handed to patients. The marker inconsistency wasn't evidence of anything sinister. It was a clerical footnote, nothing more. A shadow of a mistake that had already been fixed before it ever became a real one. She called Hyunwoo immediately, her voice shaking now for the first time through this entire ordeal, but shaking with relief instead of fear. "It's nothing," she said. "It's a paperwork error from the transfer day. The baby is ours. Completely, biologically ours. I have the documentation right here." He exhaled so hard, she heard it clearly through the phone. "I never doubted it," he said, "not for a second. But I'm glad you found the answer yourself." That was, in a strange way, one of the proudest moments of the entire pregnancy for Tamara. Not because of what the answer confirmed, though that mattered enormously, but because of how she'd found it. She hadn't panicked. She hadn't waited for someone else to solve it for her. She'd used exactly the skill set that made her who she was, and she'd solved it in a single evening. The rest of the 8th month passed more quietly, Teresa keeping her distance somewhat, still polite, still present at appointments, but with a noticeable coolness that everyone chose not to comment on directly. Tamara told herself it was simply the exhaustion of late pregnancy. Sarang, home again for a rotation nearby, watched Teresa more carefully than ever, saying little, noticing everything. Labor started 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning, almost exactly 9 months from the day of the transfer. Teresa called Tamara first, her voice tight with contractions, and within the hour they were all at the private hospital, Tamara pacing the hallway while Hyunwoo held Teresa's hand through each wave of pain. Exactly as they'd planned, exactly as the contract had outlined, roles clearly defined months earlier by Attorney Bay. The delivery itself took 11 hours. When it was finally over, when the sound of a baby crying filled that room for the first time, everyone cried too, all 3 of them, exhausted and overwhelmed in a way words couldn't fully capture. A healthy baby girl, 7 pounds, 2 ounces. Tamara held her breath the entire time the nurse checked the baby over, and when she was finally told everything was perfect, she broke down completely, sobbing into Hyunwoo's chest, while he held them both as close as the hospital bed rails would allow. Teresa, drained from labor, asked to hold the baby, just for a second, before they took her to be cleaned and weighed properly. It was a reasonable request. Nobody thought twice about it. But a second turned into 5 minutes. 5 minutes turned into 20. 20 turned into nearly an hour. Teresa sitting up in the hospital bed with the baby pressed against her chest, humming something low under her breath, refusing every gentle attempt by the nurses to take the baby for routine checks. "Just a little longer," she kept saying, each time a nurse approached. "Please, just a little longer." Tamara watched from the doorway, a knot forming in her stomach that had nothing to do with the exhaustion of labor. Hyunwoo stepped out to quietly alert hospital security, just as a precaution, while Tamara walked back into the room, her body still sore, her legs unsteady, and stood at the edge of the bed. "Teresa," she said, her voice soft but absolutely unmovable. "Give me my daughter." Teresa looked up at her, eyes glassy, and for a moment it seemed like she might refuse outright. Then something in Tamara's face, some quiet, immovable certainty, made her loosen her arms. She handed the baby over slowly, like she was surrendering something far bigger than a single infant. "I'm sorry," Teresa whispered. "I don't know what came over me." Tamara didn't answer. She simply took her daughter, held her against her chest, and walked out of the room without looking back. 2 days after Tamara and Hyunwoo brought their daughter home, they named her Airi, a name Hyunwoo's mother had suggested, one of the first genuinely warm gestures Aomeoniso had offered through this entire process. The nursery, painted in soft, warm tones before the birth, finally had a baby in it, and for a short while, the house felt like it was healing from everything that had come before. That peace lasted exactly 4 days. Attorney Bay called on the 5th day, his voice careful in the way lawyers get when they're delivering news they know will be unwelcome. Teresa had retained her own attorney and was formally contesting the relinquishment clause, claiming she'd been coerced into signing the original agreement, That emotional pressure from the family had left her no real choice. Tamara sat with the phone against her ear, Ari asleep against her shoulder, feeling something cold settle into her chest. Can she actually win this? She asked. The contract was built specifically to withstand exactly this kind of challenge, Attorney Bay said. Your father's questions, all those months ago, are the reason we made certain provisions ironclad. I don't believe she has legal standing to succeed. But she can certainly make this difficult and drawn out if she chooses to. Isaiah, when he heard, didn't say I told you so, though he'd have been entirely within his rights to. He just asked what he could do to help. And when Tamara said there was nothing, not really, he said he was booking a flight anyway. The court date came 2 weeks later, at a courthouse downtown, all of them seated in a courtroom that felt far colder and more sterile than the situation deserved. Teresa sat across the aisle with her own lawyer, looking smaller than Tamara had ever seen her, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The judge reviewed the surrogacy agreement point by point, methodical, unhurried. Teresa's lawyer argued coercion, argued emotional manipulation, argued that a woman 8 months pregnant couldn't be expected to make clear-headed decisions about relinquishing a child she'd carried and bonded with. Then Teresa herself stood, against her lawyer's visible discomfort, and addressed the judge directly, her voice rising with an intensity that startled everyone in the room. That baby chose me, she said. She knows my heartbeat better than she knows anyone else's. And she pointed at Hyunwoo, he let me believe there was something between us. He came to my house at night. He held my hand through every appointment. You don't do that for someone you feel nothing for. Hyunwoo sat perfectly still beside Tamara, his hand finding hers under the table, gripping it firm and steady, grounding both of them. The judge, unmoved by the outburst, ruled based entirely on the documentation in front of her. The contract was valid. The relinquishment clause held completely. Custody remained, without question, with Tamara and Hyunwoo. It should have felt like a full victory. And legally, it was. But watching Teresa's face crumble as the ruling was read, watching 15 years of friendship collapse into something unrecognizable in a cold courtroom, Tamara didn't feel triumphant. She felt something closer to grief. That night, exhausted from the hearing, the family finally slept soundly for the first time in weeks. Sarang, staying over that week for a hospital rotation nearby, was up late studying in the guest room when she heard it, a soft creak from the direction of the nursery, far too deliberate to be the house settling. She got up quietly and made her way down the hall, and there, standing at the top of the staircase with Ari wrapped in a blanket against her chest, was Teresa. For a moment, neither of them moved. Sarang stood frozen at the end of the hallway, and Teresa stood at the top of the stairs, the baby stirring slightly in her arms, a set of spare nursery keys clutched in her free hand, keys she'd apparently kept from her weeks helping set up the room, back when everyone still trusted her completely. Teresa, Sarang said, keeping her voice low, careful, trying not to startle her into doing something worse. Put her down. I just wanted to say goodbye properly, Teresa said, her voice thin, unsteady. They wouldn't let me say goodbye properly. You're not saying goodbye, Sarang said, stepping closer, slow, deliberate. You're taking her out of this house in the middle of the night. That's not goodbye. You know that's not goodbye. Teresa's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment it looked like she might simply hand the baby over without a fight. Then something shifted in her expression, something desperate and unreachable, and she took a step backward, toward the staircase. That was when Hyunwoo appeared in the hallway, having woken to the sound of raised voices, and behind him, Tamara, moving fast despite her body still healing from delivery. The sight of them both seemed to break whatever resolve Teresa had left. She sank down onto the top step, still holding Ari, sobbing now, and Sarang moved in carefully, gently, and lifted the baby from her arms without resistance. Tamara reached her daughter and pulled her close, checking her over with shaking hands, finding her completely unharmed, still half asleep, unaware of anything that had just happened around her. Hyunwoo called the police that night, not out of cruelty, not out of anger, but because he understood, with total clarity, that this could not simply be forgiven with another conversation and another apology. Teresa was taken to the police station just before dawn, sitting in a small interview room, still in the same clothes she'd worn to attempt to leave the house. Tamara arrived a few hours later, once Ari was safely settled with Sarang, and sat across from an officer explaining her options. She could press full charges for attempted kidnapping. It was, by any legal standard, exactly what had happened. She thought about 15 years of friendship. She thought about the woman who'd held her hair back through hormone injections, who'd shown up to every miscarriage aftermath with soup and silence, and exactly the kind of company she needed. She thought about the woman standing at the top of that staircase, tears streaming down her face, clearly not thinking clearly at all. "I don't want to press full charges," Tamara said finally. "I want a mandatory psychiatric evaluation instead. I think something is genuinely wrong with her. I don't think this was just cruelty." Sarang, when she heard the decision later, wasn't happy about it. She tried to take Ari out of the house, Tamara, in the middle of the night. "What if I hadn't heard her?" "I know," Tamara said quietly. "I know exactly what could have happened. That's not lost on me. But I still think she needs help more than she needs a cell." The evaluation was ordered by the court within the week, and Teresa was admitted to a psychiatric hospital on the outskirts of the city, a quiet facility surrounded by pine trees, far removed from the life she'd been living just months earlier. Tamara didn't visit right away. She needed time, distance, space, to hold her daughter without flinching at every sound in the house. But 3 weeks after the admission, she found herself in the visitor's lounge of that hospital, waiting for Teresa to be brought in, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Teresa looked different when she finally appeared, thinner, quieter, dressed in soft hospital-issued clothing instead of the sharp, put-together outfits she used to wear on set. She sat down across from Tamara slowly, like she wasn't sure she deserved to be sitting there at all. "I've been in therapy every day since I got here," Teresa said, her voice steadier than it had been in months. "They diagnosed me with something that apparently I've had for years. Underneath everything, something that got worse being isolated in that house for so long. Something that just cracked open completely once the pregnancy hormones hit." Tamara listened without interrupting, the way she'd learned to do over the past 9 months, letting silence do some of the work that words couldn't. "I need to tell you something," Teresa said, and her hands started shaking slightly on the table between them. "I didn't fall in love with him during the pregnancy. I want you to know that. It happened years ago, back when you first introduced us, and I buried it, because you were my best friend, and I couldn't let myself feel it. I thought carrying this baby would prove to myself I could be around him and be fine. I was wrong." Tamara sat with that confession for a long moment, feeling something complicated move through her chest. Not quite anger, not quite forgiveness, something that didn't have a clean name. "Why didn't you just tell me?" Tamara asked. "Back then, when you first felt it. Why carry this alone for years and let it turn into all of this?" "Because I loved you more than I loved the feeling," Teresa said, tears sliding down her face now. "Or at least I thought I did. I thought if I just buried it deep enough, it would disappear on its own. It didn't disappear, it just waited." The session ended not long after, a nurse appearing in the doorway to signal visiting hours were closing for the day. Teresa stood, and for a second it looked like she might reach out, might try to hug Tamara the way she used to at the end of every visit, back before any of this happened. She stopped herself. "There's one more thing," Teresa said quietly, just as Tamara reached the door. "Something I never told anyone. Not you, not your husband, not even my therapist until last week." Tamara turned back slowly. "What is it?" Teresa's eyes flickered toward the nurse, waiting patiently by the door, then back to Tamara, and whatever she was about to say caught in her throat. "Not today," Teresa said instead, her voice suddenly small. "I'm not ready to say it out loud yet, but when I am, you're going to need to sit down first." Tamara stood frozen in that doorway, every instinct in her body telling her to demand an answer right then, to not let Teresa walk away with whatever secret she was still holding on to. But the nurse gently ushered Teresa back toward the ward, and the door closed between them before Tamara could say another word. She drove home in silence that night, Ari's empty car seat sitting beside her, Hyun-woo waiting up for her when she walked through the door. She told him everything Teresa had said, word for word, and when she got to the last part, the part about needing to sit down, she watched his face shift from concern into something sharper. "What do you think it is?" he asked. Tamara shook her head slowly, staring at nothing in particular, her mind already turning it over the way it turned over every unfinished equation, every incomplete lab result, refusing to rest until it found the missing piece. "I don't know," she said, But whatever it is, I don't think this is over. Outside, the city lights of Seoul stretched out beyond their window, quiet and unaware, while somewhere across town, behind the walls of a psychiatric hospital surrounded by pine trees, Teresa Powell sat alone in her room, holding on to a secret she wasn't ready to release, one that would change everything they thought they understood about how this all began. If this story had you holding your breath, let me know down in the comments what you think Teresa is hiding, because I promise you, it is bigger than anything you've heard so far. Hit that like button if you want to enjoy this story, and subscribe. Thank you for riding with this one from beginning to end. I'll see you in the next one.